Boker Tov, everybody. Good morning. Good Tuesday morning, and welcome to the very last episode of Hi There with Rabbi Leah. At least the last episode that I'll be taping in advance. Now that we are almost completely open for business and I'm coming in almost every day, I won't be doing these on Facebook anymore. I'm sorry, on YouTube. I'll be teaching one-on-one, face-to-face. So I'm really looking forward to doing that more and more. I promised today I would finish this discussion that we've been having about Pesach with a discussion about different types of kashrut during Passover. So there are some parts of this that every Jew is familiar with, and some pieces that may be a little bit less familiar. But depending upon what part of the world your ancestry came from, whether you were of Eastern European stock or whether you were of Sephardic stock, in other words, Ashkenazi versus Sephardic Jews being from the Middle Eastern countries, the Asian countries, Morocco and Hungary, not Hungary, but Morocco and Yemen, and so on and so forth, your diets would be different. But if we go to the ultimate source of rabbinic law, known as halakha, known as the Talmud, we learn some very interesting things about what may be eaten and what may not be eaten. So today I'm going to introduce you to this word, which may actually already be familiar to you and it may not. The word is kitniot. Kitniot. That's how I spell it in English. Other people may spell it differently. Kitniot. So we learned that there are 5 types of food that are considered chametz. Chametz. Do not eat them during Passover. And they are wheat, barley, rye, oats, and spelt. Those 5 grains are considered chametz. So anything with wheat, barley, rye, oats, and spelt are chametz. They are not to be consumed, and they are not to be brought into your home. Now we get into this whole category of what are these? Kitniot. Kitniot is a category of food that for one group of Jews, they don't eat it, and for another group of Jews, they do eat it. And the kitniot are things such as rice, corn, legumes, certain types of beans and peas, peanuts, and so on. That whole category of legumes, rice, and corn. Why don't they eat them? And is this, or why do they eat them versus Ashkenazi Jews who don't? So this is not a matter of Jewish law. This is actually a matter of custom. And I'll be fully transparent. I do eat kitniot during Pesach. I will eat soybeans. I will eat peas. I will eat peanuts. I'll eat rice. I will eat corn. And that is not something I've done all my life because I grew up in a German and Russian family in which my ancestors did not eat those things. But in recent years, within the past, I would say dozen or so years, I have started eating kitniot. And the reason is because there is really nothing halachically, nothing according to Jewish law that says you may not. So I thought, rather than just making this up and telling you this, I would read from the source. It is a mitzvah, and I'm reading now from the Talmud, to abstain from eating leaven, chametz, during the entire 7 days of Pesach. Now notice it says 7 days and not 8 days. They never heard from 8 days in Israel. It's only 7 days, 8 days outside of Israel. By chametz, the tradition means those grains from which matzah may be baked: wheat, barley, oats, rye, and spelt. So it's kind of a contradiction, because what this is saying is that you may bake matzah out of those 5 grains, but you may not consume them in anything else. So only matzah may be baked from wheat, rye, spelt, oats, and barley, but nothing else may be consumed that has those 5 grains in them. And if you think about, for example, beer being not kosher for Passover, it's because it's got barley in it. And yet you can make barley matzah. So it is a bit of a contradiction. But those are the only 5 grains. There is nothing in the Talmud that says anything about beans, rice, legumes, corn, peanuts, or anything else in that kitniot category. Why and how did these other foods become forbidden? Well, that's an interesting story, and it can actually be attributed to a couple of different things, which we'll talk about right now. So here we go. Here is the basis of this custom. The long-standing Ashkenazic custom to forbid rice and legumes during Passover did not come about, or at least the first mention of it is the 13th century. So that's the 1400s. That is modern history, considering Jewish history. Think about it. 1400 was just 600 years ago, right? So Jewish history is 5,781 years old. So 600 years is relatively modern history. There were 2 French 13th century rabbis, Rabbi Yitzchak of Corbeil and Rabbi Manoach of Narbonne, and they wrote that our teachers observe the custom of not eating rice and legumes during the festival, but then he adds that this custom is not universally accepted and that the great sages disregard it. So among his own generation, there were great rabbinic scholars who argued that it was not chametz and that there was no reason not to be eating these certain types of food. And that there were other rabbis that said, well, we've forbidden it for so long, maybe we should just stick with the custom. So this reminds me of so many things that we do in Judaism, where when you say, we always did it that way. And it reminds me of a story of a relatively new bride who decides one Pesach that she wants to try to make a brisket. And so she calls her mother and she says, Mom, how do you make a brisket? And her mother says, well, first you go to the butcher and you get yourself a good cut of meat, and then you cut the ends off of it. And the daughter stops her and says, wait a minute, why do you cut the ends off of it? And she says, I don't know. That's how your grandmother always did it. That's how my mother, your grandmother always did it. So the daughter says, well, let's call Bubby and ask her. So they pick up the phone and they call Seacrest Village, where Bubby is living in independent living. And they say, Bubby, how do you make a brisket? And she says, well, you get a good pan and you get a good cut of beef, and then you cut off the ends of the meat, and then you put the meat in the pan. And both the daughter and the mother say, wait a minute, why do you cut the ends off the meat? That's perfectly good meat. Why are you cutting the ends off of it? And the Bubby says, I honestly don't know. That's how Great Bubby did it. So they call Great Bubby, who's living in a retirement community in Boca Raton, Florida, and she gets on the phone and they say, Great Bubby, how do you make a brisket? And she says, well, first you go to the butcher, you get a really good cut of kosher meat, and you cut the ends off the meat. And they stop her and they say, wait a minute, why do you cut the ends off the meat? And she says, Are you kidding? In the shtetl, we were so poor, we only had one little pot. And in order to get the meat into it, you had to cut the ends off it to make it fit. So some of these customs come about for reasons other than making sense according to Jewish law. And there was a whole group of rabbis who said, this custom of not eating rice and legumes is absolutely ridiculous. It's a baba misa. It isn't something we should be doing. In the meantime, Sephardic Jews, those Jews from Spain and Portugal, Morocco, Yemen, Iraq, Iran, and so on, rice, beans, and legumes were and are a staple of their diet. And so without those, they're not going to have much to eat during Pesach. So this whole notion that these things are chametz is really custom and not at all halachic law, not at all rabbinic law from the Talmud. And one of the reasons was that, which is also kind of a, not a silly reason, maybe a justified reason, that when you take rice and cook it and you grind it up into a flour, or you take corn and cook it and then or dry it out and then grind it up into a flour, that these sorts of things might look very much like wheat flour, barley, oats, and so on. And that there's a possibility that you could mistake one for the other and inadvertently, instead of using the rice flour, which would be okay to bake with, you would use the wheat flour instead, which was not okay except for making matzah. So there's actually a piece of this part in the Talmud that says not even a beginning Talmud student would make that mistake. So they're saying, even a little pisher Talmud student wouldn't make the mistake of mixing these grains. And, they're talking about a time in history without electricity where perhaps the housewife who was doing the baking and the cooking at that time would go into a cellar or into a storeroom, and maybe it was dark and she couldn't flip on a switch to look at what she was taking. And therefore, she might mistake the corn flour and think and take the oat flour instead, and that was chametz. So again, these are customs. They're almost indefensible customs, and even according to the Talmud, they're indefensible customs. Okay, so Ashkenazi Jewry held fast to this custom of rice, legumes being chametz to this day. And so even at Seacrest, we go through a major transformation at this time of year where we do not serve any rice, any corn syrup, anything with corn syrup in it, including beverages. No beans, no peas, no nothing of that kind, no grains at all, so that we don't make the mistake. But we know that the custom didn't spread among the Sephardic Jews. We know that the Ashkenazi Jews were the only ones still following this custom. Rabbis in Spain and elsewhere didn't hesitate to express their astonishment of it and, frankly, their poo-pooing of it. And although the prohibition against these food items didn't gain wide acceptance among the Ashkenazim, there were some leading Ashkenazic authorities who were, who were criticizing it and saying, it's ridiculous not to be eating these foods. We can still eat these foods. They are not chametz. Then we come to the early reformers in Europe, the early reform Jews, those who split off from the Orthodox, from Orthodoxy and became more progressive in their practice. And they began to look at a number of observances, everything from wearing a tallis to not eating treif to wearing a yarmulke to not driving on Shabbat, and a lot of other prohibitions, and began to look at these things through the eyes of a modern lens. And the early reformers began to throw out those things which they felt no longer had bearing on their practice as Jews. And so the early reformers were really convinced that this observance of not eating the rice and legumes, the kitniot, was unnecessary and that it was burdensome, and they abolished it altogether. And of course, whatever the reformers were doing in the early 19th century, or the late 19th century, and then into the 20th century, the Orthodox opponents responded to this new movement by doubling down and making this decision to continue to not eat certain types of foods based upon this custom that had been established and hadn't even been heard about until the 14th century. So they insisted on the sanctity of this custom, and most of you grew up in Ashkenazi settings with parents and grandparents who came from the Pale of Settlement, from Poland, from Hungary, from Russia, from Eastern Europe. And some of you grew up as Sephardic Jews, so this custom appears to be a little bit silly to you. So you grew up having these prohibitions against certain types of food. The Orthodox, Ashkenazi Orthodox Jews defended the prohibition of rice and legumes, despite the fact that it was halachically a weak argument. In other words, there was nothing in the Talmud, there was nothing written in the codes or in the commentaries that said you could not eat these foods. And there had been criticisms leveled against it for centuries and centuries, and yet they argued that the very existence of the custom of the minhag is proof that it has to be retained. So it's like saying the fact that we stand when we say Shema is proof enough that we have to stand when we say the Shema. Not that, because there are many, many congregations during which we sit when we say the Shema. That too is a minhag, a custom. It is not based in Jewish law. So too, this prohibition against kitniot is not based in Jewish law. It is purely custom. And so, they argued because it's a custom that's been around so long, that alone makes it imperative that we continue to do it. And they said that a rabbinic decree that prohibits something in order to establish a fence around the Torah has the full force of law. We're not permitted to rescind it. So what is a fence around the Torah? A fence around the Torah is essentially creating a legal fiction that will allow Jews to do something that they might otherwise not be allowed to do because you create a legal loophole. So the best example of that I might be able to give you is the idea of the Eruv. For those of you who don't know what an Eruv is a physical boundary around a geographic area that separates that boundary from what could be literally a hand's breadth from that boundary. And it allows Jews to do certain things within that area that they might not otherwise be permitted to do. And this becomes most critical on Shabbat, because, as you know, there are many, many prohibitions on Shabbat, not the least of which is you cannot carry on Shabbat. So you are not allowed to bring a load of firewood from one residence to another, or carry a casserole for Shabbos lunch from your home to somebody else's home. However, if you are doing this act of carrying within the geographic area around which there is this wire, basically, then yes, you may carry on Shabbat. And in Israel, in fact, the entire city of Jerusalem has an eruv around it, so that you can pretty much carry wherever you want in the city of Jerusalem. So the difference, however, between the eruv and what we're talking about here with these certain food types is that the Talmud has a whole section, a whole tractate called Eruvin, which is the plural of eruv, that talks about all the laws surrounding this. And that is not the case with these foodstuffs that Ashkenazim say are prohibited for Pesach. So, even though it's widely accepted in some communities, it's not widely accepted in others. And it's not a Torah law. It's not even a rabbinic law. It's mentioned in the Talmud, but not as halakha, not as the law. So while the prohibition, it continues to be practiced by many Ashkenazi Jews, and under most normal circumstances, Orthodox rabbis will insist upon it. Now, more Jews who are more liberal and progressive will follow this standard practice, but they will also permit the eating of rice and legumes during Pesach. So, we don't take a stand and disparage the custom, the tradition, but on the other hand, we don't necessarily condemn somebody who decides to eat kitniot during Pesach. So it's really a mixed bag. The Reform movement has recognized for almost 2 centuries that the prohibition of rice and legumes is a case in which it adds no additional meaning to the holiday and can only serve as something more burdensome and difficult. So that leads us to the question, why do we do it at Seacrest? Why do we consider kitniot, beans, legumes, rice, corn, peanuts, to be forbidden for Pesach? Tradition, as Tevye would say. Tradition. That is the only reason. And so I have been lobbying for a couple of years now that we reintroduce some of these other foods, make them available to our residents, and that those who still don't want to eat them have the option of having something else. The problem that we run into is if we have one person over here who considers corn to be not kosher for Passover, and somebody over here who does, what do we do about our dishes? We only have one set of kosher for Passover dishes, actually two sets, one for milk, one for meat. But if we serve cornbread on one of the dishes, it's no longer kosher if you're going to use that same dish to serve somebody something that they consider only kosher for Passover. So it is a dilemma when you're living in a community and you have limited resources in terms of the numbers of sets of dishes that you can use. So that is the dilemma of what is chametz during Pesach. And it's a discussion and an argument that Jews have been having for 6 centuries, maybe more, and that we could continue to have today. So a couple weeks ago, before this discussion, I talked to you about Biur Chametz, the Bedikat Chametz, the search for the Chametz, and Biur Chametz, the burning of the Chametz. This coming Friday morning at 10 o'clock on the AVS patio, I will be doing a little program collecting Chametz and doing it the traditional way that maybe you did as a kid by searching for the chametz and putting it into a bag. And the following day or later that day, it will be burned by the kitchen. And that will be symbolic that we have searched for the chametz and then destroyed the chametz. And we follow that with a prayer that basically says, God, if I didn't find every little piece of breadcrumb, please forgive me. I'm only human. Or if, I didn't find that Cheeto that was stuck in the cushion behind the couch or that piece of popcorn, I will be forgiven. Because after all, we are only human and we can't possibly be perfect in the way that we need to find every little bit of chametz. So the prayer that we say absolves us, basically. It nullifies any chametz that might still be sitting around out there that we didn't find. That happens on Friday morning at 10 o'clock on the AVS patio, and everybody is invited to come from all of our buildings. Friday night, I'll be doing Shabbat blessings in all of our buildings according to the regular schedule that we've always had. Saturday morning, Shabbat services in our synagogue at 10 o'clock. And then immediately after that, we're going to scoot out of the synagogue and it's going to be reset for Seder. And Saturday night, our seders are at 4:15, and Sunday night, our seders are at 4:15. Don't forget that Sunday morning, there is also a festival service. So not only do we have services Saturday morning, but we have services Sunday morning as well. And those are specifically for the festival of Pesach. So there's a lot coming up just in this next week. And then starting the week after, and the week after, there are more holidays to come. So just continue to look at your calendars, continue to check with your life enrichment folks because they know everything that's happening. And I will see you around campus. For now, lehitraot, bye-bye from Chai There with Rabbi Leah. And if you have friends who missed this episode this morning, Tuesday morning, it will show again at 2 o'clock this afternoon. Take care. Bye-bye.